Is there actually a noticeable difference between a cheap drum set versus an expensive one? Well, today we are going to find out. I'm going to tune a cheap kit and an expensive kit the same way, with the same heads on them, same microphones, and I'm going to play the same groove on each. You tell me if you hear a difference. And then we're going to throw a little twist into this experiment to make things more interesting. So you're not going to want to miss this. Hang along for the ride. Hey everybody, welcome to the Non-Glamorous Drummer, the channel all about teaching you the important core drumming skills to help you make music faster on the drums. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Also check out my free guide below, which is designed to help you conquer one-handed hi-hat 16th in 5 steps. Go check it out. Now, on with today's video. We want to dive straight into the comparison, but there's just a couple things I got to clear up for you first that you need to know before watching the comparison. And that is that everyone's definitions of cheap versus expensive when we're talking about drums are going to vary. It's a little bit subjective. So just to put this into perspective, the cheap drum set in this comparison, I think those shells would be worth about 400 bucks probably if I were to sell them. The expensive drums, the shells, I paid $1,600 for. So roughly a 4-to-1 difference. Now in my mind, I'd say anything over $1,000, if you pay over $1,000 for shells, you're getting pretty high quality, pretty good shells. And it's hard to say what the difference might be between a $1,600 shell pack and a $6,000 shell pack, because once you get up there around the $2,000 range, there's a lot of gray area. Things kind of blur together. But that's a topic for another video. So I just want to get that out there and state that for you so you know exactly what we're looking at here. So in the comparison, I'm going to be playing a slow tom groove. I'm going to try to play the exact same groove on each kit. So hopefully we're eliminating variables. And for the most part, the kits are going to be tuned the same way. They're going to have the same heads on them, same microphone, same mic placement. There's not going to be any EQ on the drums. There's a little bit of subtractive EQ on the overheads. That has more to do with cymbals, just pulling back a couple of frequencies, but there's nothing to enhance the tone or the low end of the drums. We're going to just be listening to everything raw. There's a little bit of compression, a little bit of reverb, so you'll hear some natural room sound, but nothing too crazy. So you're going to hear exactly how these drums actually sound. A lot of that will be coming through the overhead mics. The heads are not identical on the toms or on the kick with both kits. The cheap kit has double ply clear heads, so does the expensive kit, but the cheap kit has Evans G2s, the expensive kit has Remo Emperors. And this isn't meant to be a Remo versus Evans comparison, but I just want to let you know that there are differences there, but basically it's the same type of head. They should be the same. Also, the cheap kit had an Evans EMAD head on it. I decided to remove that foam ring from it so that it would be more similar to the clear Remo Power Stroke that's on the expensive kick. That way we basically have a similar head format on each kick drum, and each kick also has a folded towel in the middle that doesn't touch either head. And we have a Shure Beta 52 mic inside each of those drums, placed on the towel. There's also a ribbon mic outside. So again, the exact same thing. No, the heads are not identical, but it's as close as we can get here because I wasn't gonna buy new heads just to make this video. And of course, there are other variables, and no experiment is completely perfect because the drum sizes are different. This kit is a 20-inch kick, 12-inch rack, 14-inch rack, whereas the other kit, the cheaper kit, is a 22-inch kick, 13-inch rack, 16-inch floor tom. But it's gonna be really interesting to see exactly how these different sizes play into this. So it's actually going to make things more interesting, even though this isn't an identical comparison. Okay, one more thing, and I promise we're going to get to the comparison. You'll notice in the comparison footage that the rack tom is not actually ringing and resonating as much as we want it to. And I should have paid more attention to that to begin with. I ended up fixing it after I did all the videoing and recording of that segment that you're about to watch. And I ended up experimenting with stands and finding a stand to put my rack tom in that actually much better allowed it to resonate fully. And so right now it actually sounds a lot better. And so it'll ring out forever compared to the stand I did have it in. But for the comparison, yeah, there's gonna be a little bit of a lacking amount of resonance and tail to the rack toms, but both the cheap rack tom and the expensive rack tom are on the same stand, so at least it's the same both ways. I just wanted to make you aware of that. And I'm gonna talk more about that in an upcoming video where we talk a little more about tuning and tom resonance and how the stand can play into that. It's really pretty interesting. Okay, now let's get into the comparison. We will compare both kits back to back at sort of a medium tuning. But of course, this comparison would not be complete without looking at some more extreme tunings also. So we're gonna now tune both kits super low and then super high so you can hear those differences as well. It'll be interesting to see how the drum sizes play into that also. So if you were listening through headphones or good speakers, I bet you noticed a pretty drastic difference. Even if you're just listening through your phone speaker, I'm sure you could tell a difference, but headphones, I'm sure you could definitely hear some differences. So first, let's talk about objectively, what are the main differences between the two kits? Well, first off, the cheap kit is very mellow. It's just a very mellow kind of sound. It's almost like it's slightly muffled, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The expensive kit is much more bright and clear and punchy. There's just a lot more, I guess, attack and just brightness to it that really sticks out and stands out. So they're just very different. It's hard to say which is better. I do like the brightness. I really like the clear tone and the punch that the expensive drums have. That's something that you're not gonna get as much of out of a cheap kit. But as we talk more about making a cheap kit work, if you like a more dull, mellow kind of sound, which very much could be appropriate for certain songs, well, the cheap kit does excel at that. The expensive snare has a more complex overtone series when it rings. You don't hear as much of a single note. You just kind of hear a musical ringing that doesn't stick out too much, and so you can get away with not muffling it at all. Whereas the cheap snare has more of a single note ring where you kind of want to get rid of it, and it's kind of bothersome. I noticed that to be true with a lot of snares. If you're looking at a cheap snare versus an expensive snare, a lot of times the expensive snare will just have a more nice, musical, rich, complex overtone series. As far as the ringing, you hear a lot of different frequencies, and when you stack all those together, you don't hear a single note. And a lot of times with a cheaper snare, you hear that single note and you feel like, oh, I gotta get rid of that because it just doesn't sound right and it might clash with the song you're playing. Like I mentioned a second ago, the expensive toms have a much more bright, punchy, really nice tone to them compared to the cheap toms that are a little flatter, a little duller, and just more mellow. The expensive kick is very punchy, very focused, a lot of great low end and tone at every tuning. Whereas the cheap kick, it doesn't necessarily sound bad, but it tends to get more flappy and almost boxy sounding sometimes. When it's tuned lower, the heads are a little too flappy, and so it has to be tuned a little higher to make sure that we're maintaining a level of punch. And basically with that cheaper kick, we really need more muffling to make it work. Whereas with the expensive kick, we can get away with less muffling and still have a very clear tone that sounds really nice. And I know this isn't a totally fair comparison because we do have a 20-inch expensive kick versus a 22-inch cheap kick, and they don't have the exact same heads on them, but they are very similar. And so with a larger kick drum, you are gonna get a little more of that flap potentially if you're tuned lower. So maybe that's not totally fair, but I do find that it's just a nicer tone coming out of the expensive one. It's kind of hard to explain, and it's more noticed in the recording than it is in the room. I'll notice that with each kick drum, I like the sound of both of them here in the room to my ears, but then when I record them, same mic placement with each, same bass drum beater, I just like the sound of the more expensive one more. It's kind of hard to explain it. So why do we hear the differences that we do? At this point, we're kind of still staying objective, but we're also getting a little bit into the subjective territory. I'll give you some of my opinions and some of my thoughts on this, because I'm not an expert drum maker, but there are a few things I do know. I believe that smaller drums are more versatile. You heard how low these smaller drums, 12-inch rack and 14-inch floor, you heard how low those went and how they actually went even lower than the cheap drums that were bigger drums. And these could go super low and still maintain tone, whereas with the cheap drums, we lost a lot of that tone when we went low, and it kind of just turned into a dull, sort of flappy sound. And that's because when you get a really nice drum, the shells are perfectly round, the bearing edge is perfectly even, it's cut perfectly, and everything's so smooth that even if you have the head tuned super loose, you're already able to get tone. And really the best comparison I can think of here to explain that is, let's say you have an uneven bearing edge on a floor tom. Well, that would be the equivalent of detuning a couple of lugs. And if you detune a couple of lugs here, you're instantly getting a flatter sound. Kind of like, right now, here's what the expensive floor tom sounds like. So it's tuned pretty low, we've got this nice resonant sound. Well, if I decide, okay, I'm gonna detune this lug and this lug. Another mark of a really nice drum is that you can actually detune lugs and it still sounds pretty decent. But what I'm getting at here, we lost a tad bit of tone, and that's because we're starting to cut off the circulation of the head. We could detune another one of these. There we go. Once we detune 3 of these, now we've got a pretty big difference. And basically what's happened, we've cut off the circulation. The head isn't able to resonate because we've totally loosened it, where you can see ripples on the head over here. And that's basically what happens if you have an uneven bearing edge. If a bearing edge is going along smoothly and there's a slight dip, it's not perfectly consistent, that's the equivalent of loosening lugs so that the drum isn't in tune with itself, even when you've tried to get it in tune with itself. And so that's why with a really nice shell, a really well-built shell, you can tune finger tight, super low, and it sounds great. Whereas with a cheap one, sometimes you gotta mess with it, and sometimes you can't go as low as you want to because it's just too flappy and lacking in tone when it's low. So for you guys watching this video who are longtime fans of the channel, you've noticed that I've got a new kit finally after years of pretty much just using the cheap kit in the videos. So I decided it was time to upgrade. So for those of you who have hung along for the ride this far in the video, I want to give you a more detailed tour. This new kit is a Gretsch. It's a Gretsch Renown. I really like this kit. It's sort of a mid-tier in the line of Gretsch kits. It's not a USA custom up there at the top, but it's a step above the Catalina Maple. And this is the first kit where they do the silver sealer inside the shells, which somehow seems to play a big part in what they sound like and how much tone and resonance you get. I don't know exactly how that works or what it is, but it's one of those signature Gretsch things that just sounds really good. And I heard great things about this kit before I bought it, and I've been very impressed with the overall quality of everything, how it looks, how it sounds, how it feels to play. A really nice kit, and so I'm definitely talking Gretsch up a bunch. I'm not a Gretsch endorser. I bought this kit with my money. It's a great kit, and so I'm saying good things about it. They advertise it to be the working drummer's kit, the versatile kit for the gigging drummer, and it definitely is exactly that, because you can tune it insanely low, and it sounds really cool. It would work great for like recording a worship record, where the thing right now is low-tuned snare, low-tuned beefy drums. It could totally do that. It doesn't matter that it's small toms. Like I was saying a minute ago, when the shells are really well built, and maybe the fact their maple does play into this, you can tune them so low and they still sound really good. I also love how in 60 seconds I can tune everything up really high and suddenly it's an amazing sounding jazz kit. You could totally go bebop with this and it sounds really cool. I love how the snare just has so much character to it. It's a really cool rim shot, a really nice crack to it. It kind of reminds me of the snare sound on a lot of the early John Mayer records when Steve Jordan was playing, or that live John Mayer record. It makes me want to play like a Steve Jordan groove, tune everything up real tight and just play like this loud cracking snare rim shot. It's so musical, it sounds really good. So really I went smaller for a couple of reasons, and the big one was that I've heard from other drummers that small drums are more versatile, and I've played a bunch on a house kit that's a really nice house kit, and I've actually played on a 12-inch rack tom and a 14-inch floor, and I was able to get those as low as I ever needed them, and I thought, you know what, if I can tune these small drums low, I know I can also tune them high because they're small drums, so why not get smaller drums? It's easier to get them exactly where I want them here in the setup. Having a 20-inch kick is easier than a 22 because I can get this rack exactly where I want it. I can fit my snare mic in here for once and not have to put it over here. Not to mention the drums are smaller, so it's easier to transport them. If you're watching this video right now after I've posted it, we're in the midst of COVID-19 and I have no gigs going on my calendar, so I haven't been able to take the kit anywhere. But when I do, I know I can put these into bags. It's gonna fit in the back seat so easily. Even if I put them in hard shell cases, I could fit them in the back seat because they're a little bit smaller. By the way, the snare is a 14 by 5.5. So it's kind of a balance of 14 by 5 and a 14 by 6.5, which is kind of interesting because it's got plenty of beef and low end. I feel like I'm playing a 6.5. It doesn't matter that it's a little bit thinner. And of course it goes super high. Sounds great tuned high. In case you were wondering why I have my rack tom in a stand here, it's because if you kind of look at the shot here from the overhead camera, you can see if I had this rack mounted off the kick drum mount, I would not be able to get it this close because I'm tall and I sit far back from the kick. And so that's why I decided to do it this way. Yeah, I could get one of those mounts to mount it off the cymbal stand, but those are just cumbersome. I don't like dealing with them, and I always just like having my rack on its own stand so I can get it exactly where I want it. And like I mentioned earlier too, depending on what stand you've got, you can actually get plenty of resonance and tone out of a rack tom, even when it's in a stand. I've noticed that heavier basket stands tend to suck a lot of the life out of a rack tom, whereas lighter old school stands, like this one I'm using here, where you fold the two arms down, extend the one up, that actually works a lot better for maintaining the resonance. So just a quick tip there that we'll talk more about in a later video. So to sum all this up, I know this has been a long video, but I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it educational and maybe even encouraging if you do have a cheap kit, because you can make a cheap kit sound pretty good. And at certain tunings, these do sound kind of close. And if you muffle a cheap kick drum down a good bit, you can make it sound pretty decent. And if you find a good in-between tuning for your toms, you can make them work nicely on a cheap kit. It's those extreme tunings that you have to be aware of, and you have to find that sweet spot with a cheap kit to really make it work. It might not be as versatile. And so really to sum up the difference between an expensive kit and a cheap kit, yes, there is a difference. And most of what you're paying for when you get a high quality kit is versatility. You're paying for the ability to tune super low and it sounds great, super high and it sounds great, and anywhere in between. Not to mention you can have everything wide open with no muffling and it all sounds pretty good. You're not having to get rid of anything that's annoying. And so that's really the big plus with a nice kit. With a cheap kit, you have to play around a lot more to find that sweet spot. You have to play around a lot with the toms. You have to do a little more muffling in the kick. You might have to work with the snare to get rid of some ring. But you can find a good sound, it just takes longer. So like I've been saying, stay tuned because in the coming weeks, we're gonna talk specifically about drum tuning. I know there've been a few drum tuning videos in the past here on the channel, but it's about time to do some more of those. And so stay posted because there's gonna be some of that coming, and I'll share all my best tips for making a cheap kit sound good because I've been doing that for years. And I'll share with you just some of the differences that you have to deal with working with a cheap kit versus a nice one, so stay tuned. Hey, I hope this video has helped you out. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe before you go. And also go download my free guide designed to help you conquer the elusive one-handed hi-hat 16ths in 5 steps, get them up to 80 beats a minute. We cover all the basics you need to know to get that happening. It's totally free. Go grab that. As always, thanks guys for watching, and I will see you on the next video.